Your Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Sharks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making the show your very first listen. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're tuning in through an audio platform, rate and review really goes a long way for both of us. I'm joined today by JD Young from Locked On Sharks, and JD, here we are once again with our two teams neck and neck at the bottom of the NHL standings. Who could have seen this coming? Hope you're doing well, my friend, and finding a way to hang in there despite the losses piling up once again this season.
Yeah, it is, again, who would have thought, right? Us two being the worst teams. Like, I think most people thought we were probably going to be in the bottom five again. But yeah, we'll start there before we kind of get into the stuff. Are you disappointed, or what kind of this season? Is it a little disappointing, kind of gone to expectations, where like as we've kind of get into the home stretch here, just kind of your overall thought on the season so far?
Yeah, I think it has been disappointing in a sense that there hasn't been consistency from game to game and rather even just period to period, JD. The Blackhawks have won back-to-back games just once this season, and considering the offseason moves that they made, I know it wasn't maybe the huge splashes like some people were hoping for and some people might be expecting this summer, but you add Tyler Bertuzzi, you add Teuvo Teravainen, you bring in Alec Martinez, a savvy veteran defenseman that's, been there, done that in all facets of the game. Surely I felt like the Blackhawks were going to take more of a step than being in this conversation right at the bottom, in the bottom three. Now, I figured they would still be in the bottom 10, probably somewhere around the 6th to 7th worst team in hockey. But to be second and have a real strong chance to pick number one overall again, while that's not the end of the world for us Blackhawks fans, and even JD, from what we've seen recently, some players on the team, it's certainly not where we wanted to be. But fortunately, the one thing I believe keeping us going is Connor Bedard, and I know you've probably been super thrilled with what you've seen from Macklin Celebrini so far in his rookie campaign. And JD, I figure the easiest spot to start this conversation and what the people want to hear about is Macklin Celebrini and Connor Bedard. Macklin has now played in 47 games during his rookie season. He's tallied 42 points, 18 goals, and 24 assists. I obviously do not tune into all the San Jose Sharks games like you do, but from all accounts, seems like everyone's been really thrilled with Macklin Celebrini's first NHL campaign thus far. Tell me about what you've seen from him and what's really impressed you the most up to this point.
Yeah, from Celebrini, he has been, I think, surpassed advertised for Sharks fans, right? And especially coming off last year where, Connor Bedard, you heard generational talent coming from Connor Bedard. It is not to say like Connor Bedard has not met expectations. Like Connor Bedard's amazing. But I think there was definitely like Connor Bedard's up here and Macklin's maybe like a step or two below. And I think what Celebrini has done this season as the youngest player in the NHL, he's not far off from a point per game production. I know he missed a month of the season to begin, but I think what we see in all three zones, right, and just how mature his game is already. And I think that's a big difference between Bedard and Celebrini. I think Bedard definitely has a much higher offensive ceiling, right? What Bedard can do, some of the stuff that he can do is just, that's why he's a generational talent. But I think Celebrini's impact in the neutral zone and the defensive zone, I think is kind of the difference right now of these two players. Not to say that Bedard can't continue to work on there, but I think Celebrini's floor is just a little bit higher. And even nights where he's having an off night and maybe not producing, you still see plays in the defensive zone and winning board battles against guys who are bigger than him. There was a clip against Adam Lowry this week, who's 6'5", and Celebrini bullies him on the board and takes the puck away, and then Lowry just comes up and like rips him from behind because he's so frustrated. And he's doing this at 18. Wait till he gets his big boy body, and then he starts to kind of, as his body matures and he gets, learns all the veteran tricks. Like that's what I think makes Celebrini so special, is just like his IQ and his floor as he's coming to the game right now. And it's going to be fun, right? Watching these two guys, the 2023 first overall pick, the 2024 first overall pick, watching how these two guys kind of be the next face of the league. And you see Bedard's face all over. And I don't think it's going to be long until you start to see Celebrini's face all over the advertisements too.
Yeah, there's going to be comparisons for years and years between these two players, especially with the deep prospect pools that they have around them as well. And I think it is just funny comparing Bedard and Celebrini at this point, because you referenced going into this year's draft, while Macklin Celebrini was the clear-cut number one overall player, he wasn't really getting the same type of boom that Connor Bedard was getting heading into him being the number one overall pick. And I think Macklin turned a lot of heads with the way he made an impact right away. And also, like you referenced, in all three zones. I think that's the biggest difference between Connor Bedard and Macklin Celebrini at this point as well. And recently on my show, JD, I broke down, I think it was, can't remember if it was Corey Pronman or Scott Wheeler, but they did a U23 prospect ranking. And, Bedard and Celebrini being right there at the top, it's much more of a conversation right here, right now than it was 4 or 5 months ago. And I think it's because Macklin Celebrini plays that grown man game. He makes plays. He makes winning hockey plays all the time in all three zones. And quite honestly, what I've just learned from watching Celebrini and from watching Bedard in a year and a half now is they are just different type of players, even though they were number one overall picks in back-to-back years. Connor Bedard is always going to be more of an offense-focused type of player. You can argue, for better or worse, but that's just his skill set. That's his forte. And he's also a little bit undersized compared to Macklin Celebrini. Bedard about 5'9", 5'10", depends on what you're looking at, around 180, 185 pounds. Macklin Celebrini's just a little more built out and has a couple of inches on him as well. And I think, his game is just set up to have more success in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Connor Bedard reminds me a lot of Jack Hughes, and he's just going to have to find ways to get around with being the smaller guy out there on the ice. And look, he's 19 years old and he doesn't have a whole lot of heck of a lot of help alongside him. And, looking at the points from Connor Bedard's rookie year and comparing it to Macklin Celebrini, 61 points, 22 goals, 39 assists, and 68 games for Bedard. By all accounts, that is an absolutely phenomenal rookie year. And I would even say what he's doing this year, considering the lack of offensive help alongside him, Tyler Bertuzzi, who's been brought in, has not really been consistent whatsoever and hasn't been consistently on the top line along with Connor Bedard. Like, it's been an absolute nightmare, and Bedard is still finding a way to put up near a point per game metric. I think the biggest thing for Connor Bedard is looking at someone like Jack Hughes and the New Jersey Devils through those first couple of seasons. There were struggles there, but once more star players start to step on the scene and you get him some more help, that's where you really see him thrive. I think the same thing is going to happen with Connor Bedard. And JD, I think we're talking about two unbelievably high ceiling type of players. Connor Bedard might have the higher offensive ceiling, but I think Macklin Celebrini is going to be a little bit more trusted upon by his coaches in all situations. And listen, we're splitting hairs here between like a Macklin Celebrini, Connor Bedard type of discussion. There's no real wrong answer here, but I do agree with you. The biggest thing that stood out and the thing that's made this gap narrower in terms of the Bedard and Celebrini comp is just how much Macklin Celebrini can play like a grown man and help his team win in all facets of the game.
Yeah, and I think too, Mike Grier went out of his way, and it's not to say that Blackhawks didn't do this, but I think Mike Grier went out of his way to find that veteran in Tyler Toffoli, right? And I know Taylor Hall was supposed to be that guy, and he missed last year, and it just didn't work out. And Tyler Toffoli has been an absolute hit for the Sharks. A guy who wanted to be there, signed a 4-year deal with a no-move clause. Like, he wants to be here for these guys. And him and Celebrini have been a huge part of it. And I think also, too, kind of the first real foundational piece for the Sharks, William Eklund, he's been playing as well. And you just see that chemistry coming along where he just has more support around him. I like Eklund. You could see these two guys playing together for the next 10 years, right? And Toffoli is going to be here for the next 4 years and wants to be here. He just has a little bit more support when I think it comes out there. And, Celebrini has been, as you mentioned, like, he's been a guy who's been trusted. Defensive zone draws, like with a minute and a half left, like must-win draws. He's the guy out there, like, doing that stuff. And I think that just speaks to, again, how mature his game is and just how quickly he's earned the trust of Ryan Warsofsky. And again, like, it's I have to pinch myself sometimes because I'm like, this kid's 18. Like, we're going to have him hopefully like the next Sidney Crosby, like, where he's just going to be here for the next 20 years and he's just going to be awesome for the next 20 years. And that's the hope. So, It's pretty fun. It's well worth what we went through last year to have Macklin Celebrini on my team. Worth it.
He's been special to watch so far, man. And you alluded to the faceoffs, one metric I forgot to bring up. Celebrini's won 48.7% of his faceoffs so far in 47 games. Connor Bedard in his rookie year, 38.9% of the draws. Now, it takes longer for some guys, but again, I just think Macklin's game is more set up for that style. And the Blackhawks, I think one thing that's really become clear throughout the course of the season, JD, is they just need to do a better job of the guys that they bring in the offseason next year in the free agent market or through trades, whatever it may be. They need to be more sure that they can provide consistent play along with Connor Bedard and get him more surefire help. And I also think one thing that I do want to mention as well, the coaching situation with the Blackhawks, I don't think has done Connor Bedard any favors as well. Luke Richardson, who was the head coach, was very defensive minded and ran a very tight ship defensively before getting fired. And I think Andrew Sorensen, who's now the interim, is just in a little over his head. The Blackhawks are trading pieces. Like, it's a really tough time for Connor Bedard. And despite all that, he's still finding a way to put up nearly a point per game. I think you have to be so excited about the future of both of these kids, and it's going to be fun, I'm sure, watching them hopefully have playoff battles in the not too distant future for us, JD. But good conversation on Bedard and Macklin Celebrini to kick off the show. Coming up in just a moment here, we'll dive into Seth Jones and Erik Karlsson potential parallels, as Seth is clearly wanting out of Chicago. Real quick, though, I do got to talk to you all about a new sponsor here on the Locked On Podcast Network, which is Trade Coffee. If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee, but I got tired of settling for grocery store brands that just weren't cutting it. That's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, this coffee is next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the U.S., bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. And their experts have taste-tested thousands of coffees, curating over 550 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. My first batch was an absolute game changer. It had a smooth, rich flavor, and I could actually taste the difference from my usual coffee. And right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off on your first order at drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. Again, that's drinktrade, TRADE.com/LockedOnNHL for 40% off your first order. The coffee that's next level. All right, segment 2, JD, I know you wanted to talk on the show a little bit about some potential Erik Karlsson and Seth Jones parallels, as 4 years left on Seth Jones' deal with the current status of the team. Their goals don't really match up with the organization's. The floor is yours with kind of how you wanted to steer this conversation, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this, right? You're seeing what's happening, right? And after the Utah game where Seth Jones definitely had his feelings about things, and it's understandable, right? A guy who wants to win, all players want to win, but it's like just the parallels between these two guys, right? They both trade, the Sharks traded for Erik Karlsson, kind of the end of their dynasty, make that one last run with Erik Karlsson. They sign him to a big extension. Of course, things don't work out. Surprise, right? Things don't work out. He, kind of battles some injuries. He does have that one season, right? There's one magical season with the Sharks where he puts up over 100 points, ridiculous season, wins the Norris, and then he gets traded to the Penguins the offseason, right? Seth Jones acquired kind of at the end of the end of the Blackhawks run, right? We're gonna one last run, guys. Things fall apart. They, of course, signed him to a long-term extension. And we're at the middle point where Seth Jones wants to try to go win somewhere. So it's just really interesting. And I think with the Sharks, they got very lucky with Erik Karlsson just going Super Saiyan for an entire season. And his value was extremely high. They were able to trade him, getting back a first-round pick, which turned into Sam Dickinson, Mikael Granlund, which they flipped for a first-round pick. That trade worked out really well for the Sharks. And I know the Blackhawks aren't going to trade Seth Jones just for nothing, but could this be another almost Erik Karlsson trade 2.0 where maybe in the long run it might stink right now and you might be eventually the worst team in the NHL, but what you get back, maybe it's worth it for you?
It's going to be really interesting to see what the Blackhawks get in return here, JD, because There's so much involved in this. Seth Jones having a no movement clause, the deal running through 2030 at $9.5 million. The Blackhawks.
Man, this all sounds familiar.
Yeah, right. Am I breaking up some demons at this point
Yes.
in time? Seth Jones, unfortunately, has not had that 100-point season that Erik Karlsson did to help boost his value. But regardless of that, Seth Jones is still a very fine defenseman, and he's played really well this season outside of one horrendous game against the Calgary Flames, which Blackhawks fans who have always had this disdain for Seth Jones will easily point out. But the only reason people have these feelings for Seth Jones is because of the $9.5 million AAV next to his name. Is it a couple million too much? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. But at the end of the day, Stan Bowman's the one who gave Seth Jones that deal. Seth Jones just put his name on the paper, and no one seems to blame Stan Bowman for that. And people just, even from day one and Seth Jones starting his tenure here with the Blackhawks, I don't think anyone really gave him a fair shake because of that contract and the number alongside it. Now, what needs to be retained in order to get Seth Jones down to fair value? That's the $1 million question. The Blackhawks are probably going to have to retain some, which comes with its own complications. That's taken up one salary retention spot for another 5 years. Maybe you have to get another team involved to cut that number in half and get it to 50%, half of 9.5 million. You know, math was never my strong suit, but just shy of about 5 there. That's probably more around the fair number for Seth Jones. That's probably actually a fair deal for Seth Jones, especially with the salary cap going up. So maybe it's just his 25% retention, but at the end of the day, the Blackhawks aren't going to be getting a big lug for Seth Jones. But quite honestly, while it is disappointing that his tenure isn't going to work out here with the Blackhawks, it's not really at his fault, right? Like, the trade of Seth Jones was just a wrong decision by Stan Bowman. They shouldn't have tried to make this dynasty longer than what it was. It put off the eventual rebuild even longer, and that's what has put us in this absolute dark spot. And Seth Jones really has never had talented rosters to work with here in Chicago. And I addressed this on my show today. Like, I understand Seth Jones' frustrations. He didn't sign up to get traded to Chicago to go through a full-scale rebuild. It's been losing season after losing season. He's now seen
playing for a Blue Jackets team, which was losing season after losing season.
Right. Yes. Like, I absolutely understand his frustrations. And what he said in the media last night, JD, like, there were absolutely no lies there. But it's gotten to this point now where Seth wants to win. He's absolutely sick of the no growth from this team in the 4 years that he's been there. And I absolutely understand it. I don't know if he's going to wind up getting dealt before the deadline just because of all the complications. His no movement clause. The latest I heard, he hasn't even given the Blackhawks the list of teams he'd want to be traded to. I think it's more likely something winds up happening in the offseason. But regardless of what the Blackhawks get back, it just needs to be time to usher in that new era of defensemen. And we'll be talking about defensemen here in just a second during segment 3, but Sam Rinzel could possibly be signing his entry-level contract after his sophomore year with Minnesota, right-handed defenseman. Artem Levshinov, right-handed defenseman, is going to be coming up. Now, you still need to have veteran defensemen to show those guys the ropes, but Seth Jones at $9 million with what this team is trying to do, we can find a way to get that off of the books and just kind of give this team more freedom. It's going to be fascinating to follow along with that whole thing, though, because there are so many complications. The too high of AAV, I don't know exactly what the Blackhawks are even looking for in return, right? Like, they could get a draft pick, but they don't really need one with how many draft picks they have over the next few years. I'd be more interested in getting, some noteworthy prospect if you could. But again, it depends on what AAV gets retained. Lots of complications, but tough situation for the Blackhawks. And I really do feel for Seth Jones. I got to ask you, though, while we're on this topic of conversation, JD, I know there probably wasn't the same level of disdain for Erik Karlsson, but
there was.
Was there?
Erik Karlsson was,
that
because
was what
Erik
I was going to
Karlsson
ask.
Erik Karlsson was thought to be the guy who killed the Sharks dynasty, like they're, kind of changed the franchise, right? Because, you look at the timing where he came in, right? He came in the 2018 season, last year of his deal from the Sens. That was their last hurrah, right? They get to the Western Conference final. They lose to the Blues, who just
really wish you beat them. Wish you beat
everybody
them.
wishes we beat them because they just headshotted their way to a championship. But anyway, and that was the year where you had the Game 7 against Vegas. You had a crazy Game 7 against the Avalanche with that was just everything kind of felt like it was there. The Sharks year, they were finally going to do it. that offseason, the Sharks make the choice to re-sign Erik Karlsson. Of course, this is pre-pandemic, before the salary cap freezes for the next 4 or 5 years. Joe Pavelski walks in free agency, and a lot of people think because of the Erik Karlsson signing, Joe Pavelski left town. I always thought it was Evander Kane because they traded for Evander Kane the year before, gave Evander Kane a 7-year deal at $7 million. Joe Pavelski signed a 3-year deal at $7 million. Those numbers, anyway, but a lot of people think Karlsson was kind of the death of this. So when he left, there was a lot of fans who were not sad at Erik Karlsson leaving. And I do like, I always liked Erik Karlsson. I think Erik Karlsson is one of those players who gets a lot of bad rap for no reason. Like, can the dude play defense? Not really, but he's so good offensively that he doesn't have to play defense. And what he does on the ice, there's not many people who can do the same thing. And I think the timing of the pandemic, and this team was already starting to kind of age out of its, that was very much the last run for them. So he very complicated history with Sharks fans with Erik Karlsson. So there's a lot of Sharks fans who like he's the reason why the Sharks team is where they are right now. And it was, like you said, this team was falling apart. It was, the rebuild was coming. They tried to push it off as long as they could, and he just is unfortunately the face of what happened. So
it's the blame game. It's the blame game.
It's
as simple as that. It sounds very familiar. Before we go into segment 3 real quick, JD, we like to keep it light here on the show. I got to share the story with you because you said Game 7 against Vegas, and it made me think about where I was watching that Game 7 against Vegas. This is a true story. It was my senior year of college. I was at a concert, and I'm not kidding. The guy in front of me has his phone out in his wall. I'm right behind the one other hockey guy in Columbia, Missouri, watching this game right now. I'm literally at a concert watching the end of this hockey game. Couldn't believe what I saw. Couldn't believe the setting that I was watching it in either. Absolutely.
That's
incredible.
amazing. I was sitting on my couch. My youngest son at the time was, he was, a year and a half old. He's asleep. Both my kids are asleep. My wife, is a nurse, works at night.
Long.
She's at work. I'm losing my mind, but I'm also having to be cognizant that I need to be quiet so I don't wake up my children. But I was at the point where I was this close to turning off the TV. Once it got up 3-0, I was this close to turning off the TV, and just kind of, but luckily I didn't turn off the TV, and I stayed and I watched, and it was one of the greatest moments in the history of the franchise. So
Logan Couture and Kevin LeBanc forever, right, JD?
Yes.
Coming up during simpler times. Coming up during segment 3, we'll turn the corner here and dive into some 2025 NHL draft talk, as both our teams are right at the top of the Tankathon standings. JD, at least we find our two teams at the top of some sort of standings here down the stretch of the season. It's not necessarily the standings you want to be, but San Jose Sharks currently number 1, Blackhawks number 2 in the Tankathon standings. San Jose with 38 points, I believe. The Blackhawks are at 41. It's going to be a battle down the stretch. All of our fan bases are going to be, I'm sure, tuning into tankathon.com to see the odds. But there's a lot of conversation around the number 1 overall pick. It feels like Matthew Schaefer has the edge at this point, but unfortunately he's been injured since the World Juniors. Kind of feels like there's just a big 4 in this draft class, but Schaefer's the one who separated himself, But
and his shoulder. No, it's clavicle.
Had to. It was a layup. Well done.
That was a layup.
But I'll start with you. Should the San Jose Sharks wind up with the number 1 pick in this year's draft, is it going to be the easy layup going with Matthew Schaefer?
I believe so, right? And especially you look at the Sharks prospect pool, and you always want to draft best player available, right? Especially when you're picking at the top, and try to figure it out later if you need to. But looking at the Sharks prospect pool, they drafted Sam Dickinson last year, who's projected to be at minimum of top 4, potentially that number 2 guy. Matthew Schaefer would be kind of that last piece that you hope for, right? For them. And we'll see if he's playing in the NHL next year or not. It's kind of I don't think anybody in this year's draft class is going to be we knew Bedard's playing the NHL. We knew Celebrini's playing in NHL. I don't think anybody in this year is like a slam dunk that they're going to be playing in the NHL. But Schaefer would be that last piece in that puck moving offensive defenseman that the Sharks they don't really have. The big problem is he's left-handed, and the Sharks do have a lot of left-handed defensive prospects, but nobody like Schaefer in their prospect pool. So I think they would go with him. The other one, I think, who Sharks or I know Blackhawks fans are hopefully circling her is Michael Misa. Misa, who plays with Saginaw, he's been playing with Sharks prospect Igor Chernyshov, who they picked second in the beginning of the second round. He was expected to be a mid-first round pick.
Great pick. 33 was unreal.
Fell because he needed shoulder surgery and he got a sunburn and has absolutely been dominating the OHL. He's at 3 points a game for a little bit. It's fallen a little under 3 points, but him and Chernyshov and Misa have had unreal chemistry. And there's a lot of Sharks fans also pointing that way. But I think though for the Sharks, like they're in a good spot where no matter who you pick, like it's good. Like if you pick any in the top four, you're gonna have a great time. And if you have questions about Will Smith being a potential center, Michael Misa maybe help answer that question or at least give you a little bit of backup there. Or if you want to get Schaefer again, you're having Dickinson and Schaefer as your potential top pairing, even if one guy's playing on his offhand. That's pretty sweet. I think though for a lot of Sharks fans, the question is the Blackhawks, right? You've picked last year, you picked second, you got a defenseman. 2 years ago, you picked Evan Korchinski at number 7, another defenseman. Would the Blackhawks dip back into the defensive pool, or do you look at like Celebrini and Smith, right? Smith was picked 4th in the Bedard draft. He's come in, had a fine rookie season. Do you try to find that running mate for Connor Bedard, and whether it's Misa or James Higgins or Porter Martone, like, is that, you think, the direction that they go?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating if the Blackhawks wind up with the number 1 overall pick because of Schaefer's ascension. I really thought going into this year, I thought James Higgins was going to be the one to separate himself. I projected him to be the number 1 overall pick, but just hasn't really gone that way. Not that he's had a poor, freshman season with Boston College, but what Schaefer was able to do, and the kid being only 17 years old, all the upside in the world. And also Michael Misa, as you referenced, going bonkers for the Saginaw Spirit, a guy who has a little bit more size and maybe an uptick in the goal scoring department compared to James Higgins. It's going to be really interesting because of the Blackhawks' depth on the defensive side of things already. Lev Shinov, even though he's a righty, Rinzel, the left side of things is really stacked too. Kevin Korchinski, you mentioned, Wyatt Kaiser, Ethan Del Mastro, Alex Vlasic is already on the scene, right? Like, It's a deep blue line prospect pool that the Blackhawks have. I really don't know where they'd wind up going. Best player available is never a mistake, right? And Matthew Schaefer is probably the best player available, but the Hawks' biggest need is more help along with Connor Bedard. Frank Nazar, I love the kid. I think he's going to be a real special player, but he's another undersized forward, and I think you need someone who could potentially play on that top line with Connor Bedard come playoff time, because as we referenced during segment 1, JD, Connor Bedard doesn't have that size, and he plays a little bit more just of an offensive-minded game. I think he's going to need players, skill guys alongside him who can help get it done in the most meaningful time of the season. Michael Misa is the prospect who immediately jumps out to me in that department. I think if the Blackhawks wind up picking 2nd overall and Schaefer goes off the board to San Jose
slam dunk Misa, run that thing up to the
it's almost right wild there. That like I almost want the 2nd pick instead of the 1st because I don't want the complications. I don't want like the decision making. I wonder if the Blackhawks would think about trading down, but they'd still have to trade down within that top 4 because you want one of those guys. And I do think
we just never see people people don't trade top 5 picks in the NHL. Like you see it all the time in other leagues, but like people, it's like you look at the history, people just don't do it. Like it's usually like that 7, like pick number 7 is where you start to see people trade, and then like even trading up, it's usually like pick number 10 or 11. It's like once you get to double, and this year's draft class, it's not the strongest. So like having a pick in the top 4 is where you want to be, and both our teams are well set up to have one of those 4 guys. But I know you mentioned Misa and like trying to find. It's interesting though, because like Higgins is like, if you want a more two-way center, like Higgins is actually the guy between Misa and Hagen's, like where his defensive game is just at a much higher point right now than Misa. Not to say that Misa's can't get there. Misa does have some questions if he's going to be a center or a wing, but again, like there's a reason why he was an exceptional like status player, and there's a reason why he's put up a bajillion points in the OHL. So, but again, right, just pick the best player, and you'll hopefully can figure it out. So yeah,
I feel like they're two leagues. Like ask different things out of them too. Yes. Like James Hagens is playing against grown men. Michael Misa is playing in an offensive minded league. That's what makes it even more difficult. Like Misa could be a somewhat defensively responsible type of player, but he's not really being asked to do that in his league where offense is the bread and butter.
In Saginaw, like I have watched Saginaw games, they have they are run and gun. They have to outscore their problems, and they're really good at outscoring their problems. But like to ask them to lock it down defensively it's a tough ask for them. So that they do, like that's why you see them score 6 or 7 goals tonight, because they have to score 6 or 7 goals tonight. There is some thought that Misa after this year might go to the NCAA next year as well, and then that kind of help round out his game, especially with the new kind of rules between the NCAA and the CHL. So that could be one of those things where he scores a bajillion points now, and then next year I'm going to go play against grown men, get myself ready to go kind of make that jump in the NHL, and then you kind of get the best of both worlds there.
I'm really fascinated to see how they're going to finish each of their seasons with competition kind of picking up at the end of the year. But James Hagens, I really thought was going to be the guy when it was all said and done. I just believe the Blackhawks are in a spot to shoot upside. And I think Michael Misa would be the higher upside player, but ultimately what it's going to be determined by is just the draft rankings. That's what I've said on my show. I've gone through like early leans on all of these guys and gone through updates, right? It's just going to wind up mattering in the Blackhawks case in particular, who winds up with number 1, what pick the Blackhawks get. I think that'll be more telling ultimately who they wind up with. But JD, always fun getting together for these crossovers. I wish it was better circumstances, man. Hopefully one day here soon, we can be talking about better hockey one day. Keeping my fingers crossed, man. But please, for my audience out there, make sure to let them know where they can find Locked On Sharks down the remainder of the season.
Of course, Locked On Sharks, wherever you get this podcast, and you can watch on YouTube as well. We're already starting our draft profiles, and again, these two teams are going to be very interesting. I know we're getting our first Celebrini Bedard game here in a couple weeks too. So finally, our first Celebrini Bedard game. It's going to be fun, buddy. It's going to be fun.
Is that one out on the West Coast, or is that at the UC? Do you know?
I can pull right now. I'll check right now. I think it's
West Coast, because I want to say when they were supposed to meet up, I was going to go to the game, but Celebrini got hurt.
Yeah,
so I want to say that one's in San Jose.
Yeah, that one's in San Jose. So yeah, March 13th in San Jose. So yeah, that one's gonna be fun.
Definitely have that one starred Blackhawks and Sharks.
That's a big tank game right there. Big tank game.
Don't go to overtime. No.
Don't go to overtime.
Well, to everyone out there who tuned into today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Sharks, just want to say thank you very much. A reminder to go in and subscribe to both of our shows over on YouTube. You can follow the podcast for free wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great remainder of your day.